Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. I don't know about the rest of you. I feel like I'm ready to take over the world after this morning's panel and the Attorney General. It was all quite exciting. So thank you all for rejoining us this afternoon for our final panel, which I am sure will be robust. Just a few housekeeping details before I turn this over to my colleague, Inamai Chettiar. Again, a few people have stopped me. If you need the Wi-Fi password, again, it is, my Apple just closed on me. Give me 1 second. It is, the username is guest, thank you. See, I just gave it to Mr. Finkelman and he's to my rescue. It's guest111 and the password is HALIAHDS as in Sam. Again, HALIAHDS as in Sam. Thank you, Mr. Finkelman. I was told it didn't matter, so okay, you're welcome. And I also wanted to just say a special thank you and recognize, but I don't see her here. We were joined by one of our Brennan Center board members, Gail Furman, later in the morning, but I don't see her here. Oh, there you are. Hi, Gail. Thank you so much for joining us. Gail Furman of the Brennan Center board. Thank you so much.
Jason's mom.
So with that, I think that's all the housekeeping. Again, thank you all for your rapt attention and your invigorating questions and energy. We've so much appreciated it. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Inamai Chettiar, who's the head of our justice program.
Thanks, Nicole. So thank you for joining us at our final panel. For the first part of today, we have been talking about reforms to law enforcement. And now we're going to shift gears a little and talk about another very important area for reform, criminal justice funding. And to join us, we actually have some of the nation's leading experts on economics and criminal justice policy, many of whom have left the president uptown to come and join us. So we have today, to my left, Jeremy Travis, who's the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, a nationally recognized expert in criminal justice. Jeremy co-chaired the National Academy of Sciences' recent report on the causes and consequences of high incarceration. He was previously director of the U.S. Department of Justice's National Institute of Justice. And then we have Bob Greenstein, who's the president of Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Bob is one of the nation's leading experts on the federal budget and how it affects the poor. His work covers a range of domestic policy issues, including anti-poverty, tax policy, health reform, and Social Security. Then we have Neera Tandon, who is the president of the Center for American Progress, one of the nation's most prominent progressive policy groups. Among other positions, Neera was policy director for Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign and for the Obama-Biden transition team. And then we have Gene Sperling. Gene has served as the director of the National Economic Council for 2 presidents, most recently for President Obama. An expert on budget issues, he's known for his economic leadership, expanding tax credits for the working poor, and advocating for education. And finally, to my furthest left, we have Mark Earley, who has served as the Attorney General of Virginia and as state senator. He was also president of Prison Fellowship, which is the group founded by Pat Nolan, and it's one of the nation's largest religious groups serving prisoners. He's also a member of Right on Crime, which is the group of conservative leaders advocating for reduced incarceration. So I just want to quickly start off with a few questions to our panelists, but I'll just provide some brief background. I know we just heard from the Attorney General and the importance of shifting funding and success measures. And so I think most of you have one of our recent reports, Success-Oriented Funding for Criminal Justice. So as mentioned by the Attorney General and numerous other folks today, the country spends $260 billion a year on criminal justice. These dollars come in the form of budgets, grants, salaries, and contracts, and they fund law enforcement, prosecution, and prisons. But often these dollars carry with them inadvertent or explicit incentives that can actually help increase mass incarceration and increase unnecessary arrests, prosecutions, and imprisonment. And one way that we think that these incentives can be changed is through a policy model called success-oriented funding. This is a policy model grounded in the basics of economic incentives. And what it would do is tie government dollars as closely as possible to clear outcomes that drive toward reducing crime, reducing incarceration, and reducing recidivism. And so with that, I'm going to ask the panelists to talk a little bit about the policy model, as well as the power of financial incentives and some of the economic backdrop of mass incarceration. So my first question is actually to Jeremy. So Jeremy, you've worked on criminal justice policy for decades. Can you provide some historical perspective on federal dollars and grants and how that affects state and local practices?
Well, there's a perspective. First of all, I want to say thank you very much to NMI for the invitation to be back at my law school, and for the work of the Brennan Center on criminal justice issues generally, but particularly the new focus on incarceration and linking this to the work that you've personally done on monetary incentives. So this is a very good time to be having precisely this conversation and to be having it here. So the larger question of what is the role of the federal government in providing incentives to states and local governments generally on crime policies? It has to start with the recognition that most of the money is state and local money. So the federal, unlike other areas of social policy where the federal government is the driver of policy, here we're talking about what role can the federal government play in setting incentives, inducements, providing themes, providing direction. And the Attorney General's speech that we just heard was noteworthy in that he made a number of announcements of federal funding to do precisely that. Justice reinvestment, reduce incarceration, do something about crime, do something about race and policing. So that is a federal government role. There are examples in our national history of a much more direct role of the federal government in providing direction to state and local governments on what to do about crime. Certainly the Clinton era community policing bill, which I was part of, started in 1994, provided 100,000 police officers and a lot of money to change the direction of policing, I think with good effect. But there's a part of the 94 Crime Act that we tend to forget, which I think is actually very apropos of today's conference. And this is something that we reference in the National Academy report that you alluded to that we put out in April, which was the federal government's incentive through funding to states to increase the length of sentences. People don't know that the federal government did that. Part of the 94 Crime Act was to provide money under the Violent Offender Incarceration, Truth in Sentencing provisions of that, billions of dollars to states to build more prisons, only if the states change their sentencing policies to keep people in prison longer. That was the truth in sentencing. We were all caught up as a nation in this notion of truth in sentencing, which was a great misleading label. So here we have the federal government paying, in an odd twist on federalism, paying state governments to change their sentencing policy to be more punitive. And guess what? Those people stayed in prison for a long time after that money ran out, and none of it was for operating expenses. So the federal government knows how to do this, and knows how to do it in this way, I think, in a sort of pernicious way. And the question that we face now is, can the federal government be equally muscular in helping states reduce mass incarceration as it was in helping the 28 states that bought into that promise of more money for longer sentences? Can it be equally muscular today and not just simply directional? And that's a big question, and it requires, I think, longer discussion than we're sort of prepared for at the moment. But that's the way I would frame this in terms of mass incarceration, because there's not much else the federal government can do.
Thank you. I'm then going to actually move to Bob. Could you talk a little bit about how federal financial incentives have affected state policy in some of the other areas of substantive policy, and what sort of lessons we could learn for criminal justice?
Well, while one can't say that every financial incentive ever attempted has worked, there is really strong evidence that well-designed, well-implemented financial incentives where the federal government is incenting certain types of behaviors on behalf of state governments can be extremely effective. I'll give you two examples. Between 2009 and 2013, the federal government provided performance bonuses through the CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, to states that did two related things. Number one, to qualify for a performance bonus, the state had to implement at least 5 of 8 measures that had been tested and proven effective in increasing the percentage of eligible children eligible for health insurance through either Medicaid or the CHIP program who actually enrolled. And secondly, there had to be results. You had to adopt 5 of the 8 measures, and you had to actually have an increase in child enrollment. So between 2009 and 2013, we had a recession, we had significant increases in unemployment, we had continued erosion of employer-based coverage. One would have expected that the number of uninsured children would have, at a minimum, stayed the same and very possibly increased as the number of low-income children swelled and the poverty rate went up. The opposite occurred. The number of uninsured children dropped from 6.4 million to 5.2 million. The performance bonuses are widely credited with having had a major impact here. For example, in 2012 alone, 23 states got performance bonuses for both adopting measures to increase enrollment and actually increasing enrollment among children. A second example is in the SNAP program, what we used to call the food stamp program. This one's particularly interesting, I think. Prior to 2002, all the carrots and sticks were for states to lower food stamp error rates, the percentage of benefits that were paid to ineligible people or overpaid to a larger benefit to eligible people. And that was it in terms of the incentives. So states erred on the side of denying benefits to keep their error rates down. On a bipartisan basis, this was revamped in 2002. And the performance bonuses were set up, half would go for lowering your error rate, but the other half was distributed to states based on increasing the percentage of eligible people who enrolled in the program and were served, increasing the timeliness with which people in need who applied began to receive benefits, and other things of that sort. 12 years later, here are the results. The SNAP participation rate is at the highest level in the history of the program. The SNAP error rate is at the lowest level in the history of the program. Two outstanding accomplishments. It wasn't all due to the performance bonuses, but again, all the evaluation of this is that they had powerful effects in changing state behavior. The last point I want to make is people sometimes can look at performance bonuses, and if the dollar amounts are small, they might say, why would a state change its behavior? The dollar amount isn't that large. State officials, both civil servants and political appointees, really like to be able to say and get the headline, our state achieved these goals, it was recognized for exemplary performance, and it received a federal bonus of X million dollars. The headline isn't dramatically different if it's 5 million or 100 million. It's a positive either way. So I think the power of well-designed financial incentives can be very strong.
Thank you. So actually, my next question is for Neera. So CAP has advocated for a model called social impact bonds or pay for success. Can you talk a little bit about the incentives in that model and how that relates to something like success-oriented funding?
Great, thank you. And I want to thank you for inviting me and for being part of such a fantastic panel. So CAP was the first think tank in the United States to really look at and advocate for social impact bonds. Social impact bonds are kind of innovation and funding that started in the UK, and it is really a model of private and public sector working together. And from a progressive point of view, we looked at these issues because we are facing fewer and fewer resources at the federal level, and yet in so many areas, our need is greater and greater. So essentially, the social impact bond or social financing model, social impact bond, the model is a governmental agency basically circumscribes the problem that should be solved, and essentially a private sector actor commits to solving the problem, and if they do so, they negotiate essentially a price for a solution, and if they are able to solve the problem itself, they recoup savings of some amount. And if they don't, they bear the risk of the cost. And there are various iterations of that model. And the first primary example in the criminal justice space is actually, many people know, is Rikers Island. Goldman Sachs has a 4-year social impact bond program where they're focused on reducing recidivism of males between 16 and 18. And that's ongoing. MDRC has done some initial analysis and it looks very promising. But we have to really measure these things as we go. Massachusetts has also developed a social impact bond for both homelessness and reducing homelessness and recidivism as well, and that's a model that's ongoing. So I think this is an area for exploration, and there's a lot of things that you have to navigate. You have to navigate getting the risk right, ensuring that the private sector, when it comes in, is achieving a public sector good. We have obviously seen the inverse of these issues in the criminal justice system, where there's now numerous stories, really a great amount of investigative journalism happening around the fact that they're private contractors and running prisons, and in so many ways are really using the incentive structure there is for them to incarcerate more and more people in order to get more and more funding. So obviously that is what we would consider a cap, a kind of perversion of the private sector. So it's really critical that when you're attracting the private sector into this, that it is the public sector that is defining the goal, defining the parameters, because we're obviously seeing abuses. I would just say one last thing to sort of dovetail on what Jeremy said, and really the session is about reducing mass incarceration. I think we should all recognize that we had that the pendulum has swung in some directions back, but we did go through a period where money was flooding the federal level because the theory was we just needed to incarcerate more and more people. We had a crime epidemic, we needed to address that. So I think when we're thinking about the use of the private sector and engaged in public sector activities, we have to be really mindful and guard against potential abuses, because obviously there are a number of potential abuses, particularly at the local level where people are not paying a lot of attention. There can be a kind of almost a corruption where there's private sector actors who have real incentives to actually incarcerate more and more people, and at CAP we're very focused on that challenge as well. So we think this is an area for great opportunity, but we have to be mindful and have a fair number of appropriate safeguards as we do it.
Thanks. So my next question is for Mark. So you have a lot of expertise in criminal law at the state level. Could you talk a little bit about how fiscal incentives and financial incentives play out in states?
Sure. And I'd add my chorus of thank yous to you, NMI, and to the Brennan Center for having us here today. It's been a great day. So states love to get federal dollars. They'd like to get them without strings attached, but they come with strings attached. So they're used to that. And if strings came attached to federal dollars into the criminal justice system, which basically said, you get this money and you get to keep it only if you meet measurable performance criteria that are going to keep the public safe, reduce incarceration, and reduce recidivism. That would have a really, really big effect. As some of the panel members have mentioned, a lot of the money that has come to states 10, 20, 30 years ago was all focused on law enforcement, sweeping up the streets, putting people behind bars. So if the money got redirected, I think it would have a profound effect. So I think the report that has been issued today and that the Attorney General commented on has some really profound implications for state government. Many of you who have, as most of you know, most of the people who are incarcerated in the United States are state prisoners. They're not federal prisoners. So that's where most of the mass incarceration is occurring. Those of you who have served in state legislatures or been involved with policy know that the most important committee in state government is the Finance Committee or the Appropriations Committee, just like it is in Congress. And I learned, not right away, but a few years after I got to the Senate of Virginia, why everybody wanted to be on the Finance Committee. I thought it sounded pretty dull. But then I realized by controlling the money, you actually control the shape of the programs, the focus of the programs, whether programs continue or not. So if the federal dollars that are coming to states in criminal justice have the kinds of values embedded in them that we've been talking about here today, it could have a profound impact. The great news is I think states would welcome that. As we've heard today from so many of our presenters, there's bipartisan support across the United States today for doing something about the criminal justice system. For this reason, and for many more. But for all of you in the room, if you have a family member or a loved one or a close friend who's been incarcerated, raise your hand. That's why. There's no one today in the United States that's not touched by mass incarceration. If you'd asked that question 30 years ago, in most communities across America, very few hands would have gone up. That's different today. And so I think there's a window of opportunity. There's leadership at the federal level that we've heard from today. There's leadership from policymakers and such as the Brennan Institute, and for people who are in public office to do something about it. The window could close. So I sort of always feel a sense of urgency when I'm at sessions like this, because a reduced crime rate and a bipartisan approach to something and a willingness to attach performance criteria to money is not something that happens very often with, everybody embracing it. So I think we have a window of opportunity. I think it could have a profound effect in the mind.
Thank you. So before I open it for questions, I will ask my last question to Jean. So stepping back a little, can you talk a little bit about the economic impact and economic implications of mass incarceration? Because I think a lot of people are used to thinking of mass incarceration as solely an issue of social policy and not necessarily aware of some of the broader effects on poverty and employment.
Sure. Let me step back just a second on just framing why, and this isn't the only area in the federal government, but why this is so difficult. Actually, before I do that, let me just also thank UNMI for pulling this together. And I'm happy to be here. I also want to say something that I have felt very strongly about for many years. It has been amazing to watch what's happened to the Brennan Center under Michael Waldman's leadership. I mean, it is incredible. I can tell you in Washington, D.C., at the White House, at places, the Brennan Center is now considered the place on electoral reform, voting reform, and now, as you see, criminal justice reform. And it's just, it's extraordinary to see that impact, and I'm just constantly impressed and just that much more excited that now taking on one of the other truly great issues in our country and doing so in a way that brings people together. But let me just say a little something about, I think, one of the frustrations that a lot of us have with budgeting and investment, but where it's particularly strong in this area. When you take your intro economics class, they teach you what a public goods problem is. And it's basically the idea of like, when do you need the government? Well, you need the government because sometimes no individual can capture the benefits of an investment. And so we'll underinvest. No individual company can capture the benefits of basic research, so we have to have the NIH. Well, when you look at this, it's like you have a public goods problem within a public good. Because nobody can really, who invest in long-term reduction of cost to crime, violent crime, incarceration, can actually capture that. So, and that happens really for three reasons. One is the federal-state issue that Mark Early's talking about, which is if you at the state decide, boy, we're going to really invest in things that prevent incarceration, you're going to find that those benefit, the cost, happens right up front in a yearly budget. The benefits come out over long periods of time, and they won't just be captured by the person who's doing the inspirational thing. A city who decides to do it will, the benefits will be captured by the federal government, by the state government, by the private sector, by people who aren't hurt. So even though we know that an investment in this area has huge returns to society, no one person, even within the government, can capture that. The second problem is the long-term nature of it. There's a study now in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology, and the authors are there, raise your hand. But they estimate that if you can take one 14-year-old and turn them from avoiding a life of violent crime, it saves, their estimate, the range is $3.2 million to $5.8 million. So, if you want the middle, that's $4.5 million in the middle. $4.5 million. Now, the reason this becomes very important is that, and it becomes very relevant to the things we do, is that if this was, if you were a pension fund and you could do an investment that was going to have serious returns over 15, 20 years, you would make that. The point I'm making here is nobody can make that decision because those benefits are so long spread. We don't have, in a sense, a way of doing an investment budget in the federal government. And even if we did, the benefits would kind of be spread so broadly in the society. So we have essentially a public goods problem within a public good. Nobody has the incentive to go through the pain of a one-year investment. Now let me tell you where this gets very relevant. Well, and I guess what you should think in that sense is that for all the talk of cost-benefit analysis, we don't really have a practical way of actually implementing that, because the cost goes to the good guy. It's the Virginia, Justice Department, or the Federal Justice Department, and even within there, the savings may come to the Education Department, the Health Department. So no person who makes that, but they bear all that cost, all that difficulty of that major government expenditure that may have huge amounts of return. So think about it. If it's $3.2 million to $5.8 million for a 14-year-old, then if you had an intervention that cost $50,000 per child, so you took 100 14-year-olds that could go either way, and you invested $50,000 in a 3-year intensive program for them, $17,000 a year, and 95% failure. 95% failed. The 5% who succeeded would mean a 4-to-1 return. 4-to-1 return. That's how much it makes a difference to turn one life around from a life of crime to being a productive citizen. No less what it does for their children and their grandchildren, et cetera. Now, what happens now in the budget context, and this is exactly how policy works, and I'll give you a couple examples. I work very closely on the issue of what we can do to get more low-income kids into college. So what happens right now is people say, well, this budget is so tight. So they say, well, it turns out there's a degree of high-performing low-income kids. They're high-performing, but they're not really going to the best colleges or the good colleges they could. So people say, well, there's these low-cost interventions, very easy low cost. They're proven the way they should be, random controls, so all of it's good. But the problem is there's that attraction to what is the very low cost. experiment because nobody wants to put forward anything deeper, even if the costs are higher. So then you say, well, that's great, but how about the kids who aren't going to be high performing, the 13, 14-year-olds? Well, programs like Job Corps are $17,000 a student. So people say, well, how can you ever scale that? There's a really good study, great study, interesting issue that's actually written up in Hamilton Project paper in May, which talks about the fact that too much of the too much of the programs to keep young people in the right place assume deliberative behavior. So they try to say, look, we're going to give you great incentives for a job, all these things. And the problem is that people just make too many automatic decisions in life. And so there's this whole notion that if you add a kind of cognitive behavior therapy, that people actually make them think about their decisions, assumptions of violent responses, et cetera, that may make sense, that has a huge impact. So there's this wonderful program. Barack Obama talks about it all the time. I think Michael Bloomberg, Rahm do. What's it called?
My brother's keeper.
My brother's keeper, but it's BOM. I'm sorry, I'm blanking. Boys as Men or something like that. I'll remember. But
Boys II Men is a rock band.
no, I know. I
No,
didn't
not
say
a
that.
rock band.
I
Not
didn't
a
say
rock
that. And by the way, you dated yourself by even saying that.
band. Well, you knew what I was talking about, so.
So people have done really serious studies on this. So they do 27 one-hour sessions, and these 27 one-hour sessions with a group of kids has this great impact. It reduces violent crime by about 50%. Then, it turns out that it fades away. And so then they do another one where they say, well, but if you do those 27 studies and you combine it with them having a summer job, the reduction in violent crime lasts long. Well, the authors kind of then say, well, you know what? This only reduces violent crime for a year, but even so, it has a 30-to-1 return. And, no offense to them, but, it's not really helping a kid's life if you just reduced his violent crime by a year. But the reason why they do that is because they are afraid to say the obvious, which is if they were in this program for 4 years in a row, with 4 years of summer programs, the impact would probably be dramatic. It's almost obvious. The data just leaps out at you that that's the case. Why aren't they doing that? Because they want to have a relevant policy proposal. And if you have a proposal that's going to cost $50,000 per kid over 3 years, in this budget that is constrained, you have no chance of getting such a thing, and for a population that is so politically powerless as well. So we have a very serious challenge in that we have interventions, policies that seem to work, but they may be more intensive, they may cost more, and they will return huge amounts to the society in terms of economic cost and just, human lives, humanitarian values, but we have very little way of doing that. So I think everything that you can do to push the ball in that direction. So the social impact bonds, I would expand the thinking on that. If the federal government, and this is where philanthropy can help and experimenting can come in even more and say, for this group of kids, we're going to say that this random control group of 500 kids, we know that 200 of them will do violent crime. If you can show you have an intervention that reduces that by 50%, you will be funded for eternity, et cetera, because we know what that return will be. So, I'm working with the American Achieves, Moneyball project on evidence-based. This is a place you got to go hard there because you have to make the case for the money so well. But I think the biggest budget problem we have is this public good within the public good. Nobody can actually implement the cost-benefit analysis because the costs go up front to one part of the government and the benefits are spread. And whatever we can do through the incentives, through philanthropy, to try to help somebody see the logic of the benefits that are returned so that we don't underinvest, that is the number one thing, and that's where we need to brainstorm and brainstorm and brainstorm.
Thank you. Questions? Do we have mic runners for this panel?
There's,
I hope.
there's Mike's here.
Yes, okay.
Does this work? Have there been any of these studies looking further down the road, let's say in relation to reentry after a time in prison and the economic impact of interventions at that point in time that are effective in reducing recidivism or in rearrest or inability to become productive in life? Are there any similar studies at that point in the trajectory?
So other people may know more. I mean, I think that some of the things you'd like to believe that have worked, just kind of general training job things that are non-intensive, have not maybe had the random control studies. I'll give you an example of something, though, where there's very good evidence works. In Hawaii, they did a program where they looked at nonviolent offenders, and what they did was they do a more intensive probation program. And so in other words, the average cost, so just on the economics, right, the average year of, might be different in different states, but at the federal level anyways, the 1 year is about $29,000. But probation is about $3,500 per person. Well, Hawaii probably spent more like $5,000. They upped the probation amount, but in doing that, they did more intensive care and supervision. They were tougher. There was regular, random drug tests, alcohol tests, et cetera. And they found 57% less likely to arrest, 53% less likely to have their probation revoked, and 72% less likely. So you see, that's again where it happens. Imagine you're the person in a tight budget saying it's $3,500 a year for each person probation. I'm going to $5,000. You've just dramatically expanded the budget. But if you look at reducing future arrests by 57%, I mean, that's as no-brainer of an investment as you could make.
Jeremy, do you want to add to that?
So this is Ernie Drucker who asked the question, by the way. Happens to be a John Jay. So there are a number of studies that evaluate the effectiveness of various reentry interventions. What Gene just mentioned is not technically a reentry, but it's a correctional supervision intervention that's been evaluated, is now being evaluated in other settings. It's very promising. And I think we know a lot about what works in reentry, and we know a lot about, through very rigorous evaluations. The question always is, what can be taken to scale, what can be implemented with program fidelity, and how can you sequence the things that work so that they don't sort of overwhelm a person's life. There are measures, we tend to use recidivism measures, but our measures of effectiveness tend to, or should more likely be social reintegration. Are you working? Are you with your family? Like, I want to caution, however, and I am a sort of one-horse pony on this stuff, but I want to caution that if one of the topics of our conversation is mass incarceration, that neither reducing crime nor improving reentry is going to do much of anything about mass incarceration, because that's not how we got here. So the finding of the National Academy study, which I had the privilege of chairing, that I think is so important for this conversation, is that we got here, we more than quadrupled the rates of incarceration by policy choices, not because crime went up. Because crime went up, crime went down. So the lesson that I take from that, and this is the 3 years of immersion in this, so I'm sort of passionate about it, is that we can do a lot and should do a lot to reduce crime. We can do a lot, I'm Mr. Reentry, to improve reentry. But if we want to tackle mass incarceration, we have to try to understand how we got here. So how did we get here? 3 things. We made long sentences longer. That's I gave the little example of the truth in sentencing, but it's 3 strikes, truth in sentencing, life without parole, mandatory sentences for this and that. Second is mandatory minimums. We took away judicial discretion for judges who would otherwise have sent somebody to community sanction, are now required by legislative enactment to send them to prison. And the third thing we did is a launch a war on drugs. So those 3 things, not crime rates, I'll repeat, not crime rates, is what brought us to the fact that we have so many people in prison. So the only way we can get out of here is to figure out how we got in here. And the way to get out of here, unfortunately, just because it takes a lot of work, is the same way we got in here, which is through a sort of political discussion within our democracy. So if our democracy got us here because we elected people who enacted tougher sentencing laws and launch the war on drugs, then we have to figure out, and there's a political sort of organizing and culture change strategy, how to get out of here through reducing and changing those legislative enactments. So crime, I'm all in favor of bringing crime rates down. I'm all in favor of improving reentry. But if we really want to tackle head-on the issue of mass incarceration, we have to take on the complex sort of American history of our own country that got us to this point where we have 1 in 100 Americans in prison or jail, and ask, how did that happen? And that means looking in the mirror and saying, we allowed this to happen. In some cases, we wanted it to happen, and we have to figure out how to back it out.
So I think Bob wanted I think Bob wanted to weigh in, and then Nira.
Following up on that, I wanted to comment that when we look at costs and benefits in this area, the costs and benefits should not be limited to those that are internal to the criminal justice system. For example, because of the trend Jeremy just talked about toward mass incarceration, obviously manifested overwhelmingly in the states, what we have is that since the mid-1980s, we have 31 states in which the share of the state budget that is devoted to corrections went up by more than 50%. We have 15 states in which it went up by more than 100%. Across the states as a whole, corrections spending is now the third largest consumer of state operating fund dollars, behind only education and health care. And we're up to, and it's still rising, 11 states that now spend more on corrections than everything they spend on higher education. If you compare today to 2010 in the average state, higher education spending per pupil is down over 20%. Corrections spending is huge. So the point that I'm making is another result of the move to mass incarceration. It is a direct factor in squeezing budgets for education, higher education, K through 12 education, pre-K, a variety of things that as we learn more and more how to do things that have payoffs, like effective preschool education or the returns to college education, mass incarceration is reducing the resources for other things that benefit society, benefit the economy, and in fact may themselves have positive long-term effects in fewer people committing crimes. So I think that has to be part of the benefit cost calculation as well.
And I think the follow-up there is that the incentives are within the states to reverse the trend.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're the ones who will gain,
Yes.
right? And that makes the federal role very interesting. Can the federal role be to sort of create some breathing room for those states to reverse course? Because they're the ones who gain, because it's their budgets.
And to help them with the politics of
Right,
reversing
right,
by
exactly
saying,
right.
well, we're getting these additional federal funds.
Yep.
Nira?
So I'd just like to make 2 points. First, if we're looking at costs, we should also recognize that mass incarceration is having a profound impact on family structure in low-income communities. And when conservatives talk about, or anyone talks about, the lack of stable families, one of the reasons why there's lower marriage rates, lower cohabitation rates, is because we have a mass incarceration policy. So these things dovetail together, and if we're really concerned about, economic mobility for low-income children, it's really helpful to have 2 parents around and not policies that incarcerate large swaths of communities. So I would make that point on calculating the costs. I think we need to calculate those costs as well. But just to kind of build perhaps both on what Bob and Jeremy was arguing, I definitely think we need to recognize that there are particular policies and anxieties about crime, and there was, we have experienced lower crime rates, so maybe we have more breathing room. But I'd say, I think we do have a moment of opportunity, as the Attorney General mentioned, and a lot of that is driven by this budget scenario, right? It's eating up more and more of the budget. So I would say we have to understand that these are policy implications, but these profound budget questions and being able to get higher returns on investments is an area in which you could have perhaps more Republican and Democratic governors take strong action, because it really is just the hard line of how much it's eating of state budgets. So it's bringing a lot of conservatives to the table. We have Ben Jealous, who's the former head of the NAACP, is a senior fellow at CAP, and all of his work is really around how there's been a movement of Republican governors in this space drawn by these budget arguments, but we need to make, I think that means we need to do more to make the economic case for progressive policies, because there's a ready and willing audience. Not that we should, recognize that it was sort of irrational one way and we should make it more rational the other.
Sure, and then I think we have another question here.
Hi, I'm so glad that Jeremy Travis from John Jay College mentioned the policy aspect of it, not just because he's a brilliant man and the president of John Jay College where I teach. But the other part that he added was history. And we're talking about cost-benefit analysis, we're talking about fiscal budgets, we can talk about economics, but race is an emotional issue. And one thing that we only spent 10 minutes on earlier was the impact of race in criminal justice. And we can have this great talk about finance, but there is a reason why logic is not dominating. And hearing people discuss the fact of the cost-benefit analysis of taking children at 17 and giving them these wonderful opportunities, but how are we going to now connect the dots and see how this community that's been underserved by criminal justice and overserved in the incarceration business is going to be now seen as a viable community worthy of these great strategies. That the states could save money, yet at the same time, we have this group of people who are now will be able to vote and be able to be major participants in a state that may not want to see them in that light.
Jean, do you want to take that? And then Neera as well. I saw both of you.
I'll take a little. I mean, I couldn't agree more on the, where the policy came from. I'm less a criminal justice expert, but I'm not a fan of mandatory minimums, and I imagine not a lot of people here are not. And obviously, this has been, I couldn't agree more that you have to do that. I think where though the kind of the intervention in policy is good to think about, though, in that sense, is you change the law, but then you are freeing up the cost of the incarceration. And I like thinking of it more about what you're actually going to do for people as well. Personally, just keeping people out of jail will often lead to better lives, but it's not all we should be doing. I do think on the incarceration point, I thought the Pew Foundation had a couple of things that really stood out. One was not just the economic mobility hit on a person who's incarcerated, which people have written about before, but on their children. And that once one parent is incarcerated, there's a dramatic effect of the economic mobility of their children themselves. The second thing that really stood out was that 2/3 of males who are incarcerated were working in a job before they were incarcerated. And I think there's often a feeling of, no, this is just people who are not working and are out of the labor force, and maybe they're finally they're doing criminal things or things that are off the radar. The fact that the Pew Foundation found that 2/3 were in the jobs means that had you found a non-incarceration option for them, they could have perhaps continued to be working and continued to strengthen their economic future. And half of them, according to Pew Foundation, were the primary supporter for children. So you take that person out of that situation where they're working and supporting. You've hurt the economic mobility of your kids, but you've also hurt any sense that they continue a positive economic path, and then you put, a scarlet letter on them for future employers by now having an incarceration. I do think that, going to your point too, I'll say this a little as much, we're doing evidence, but I'll say it because I think it's just absolutely true, which is, in terms of economic inequality and how it manifests itself, we all know that, here, I'll tell one to raise your hand on. How many people who are upper middle class, who send their kids to a nice private school, have had their kids' life ruined because they got caught smoking pot? Or maybe one. or a single act. The truth is that upper middle class parents advocate like crazy for their kids. They advocate like crazy for their kids. They keep their kids out of trouble. So what ends up being like the funny story that about, oh, when, little Johnny got in trouble or got caught, doing a little vandalism or even took cocaine once, etc., is life ruining for people who do not have people to advocate for them. And the incarceration for a segment of society where those who often make the laws, enforce the laws, are in positions to advocate that would never affect their own children is a huge cause of, I think, very negative racial impact and a very negative socioeconomic impact and an increasing cause of inequality. And if I was trying to say something to our lawmakers, it would be, don't pass a law that you wouldn't be willing to have enforced uniformly on your own kids. And I promise you, it's a really big story at someone who's got in private school when a kid gets expelled. And if they got expelled, it is for something that a kid in a public school without somebody to advocate for would probably be doing jail time under the current system.
Mira?
So I just building on, I guess, what Jean said, I think that the sad reality is we live in a society where there is a direct connection between racial inequality and lack of political power. And I mean, for anyone who hasn't read the story in the Washington Post last week called, I have it here, how municipalities in St. Louis County, Missouri profit from poverty, which is essentially how a for-profit system of corrections, et cetera, it goes through basically fining poor people for essentially being poor. They don't have the resources to navigate the kind of Kafka-esque correction system, and then their penalties grow and grow and grow until basically minor things, minor incidents, minor traffic incidents, through basically a system of inequality, snowball into prison time, right? And the truth is, if that was people with a lot of political power, it would never happen, right? So we have this toxic situation where people of color in large parts of the country are able to face a very unequal justice system. And I guess I'll just say it because they lack political power and political voice. And so, we can talk about the ebb and flow and policymakers making decisions, but they made those decisions because there were people telling them crime was a big problem and you had to deal with it, right? So, for me, I think we can talk about issues of budget, but we have to recognize that there's a difference in political power, and that, what I'm hopeful, though, is that you were hearing, again, conservative voices who are open to a conversation that's budget focused, that will have implications, profound implications, and how people live their lives, because hopefully we'll change the laws based on it, and it'll have a disproportionately beneficial impact on people of color.
Thanks. I think there was one question right here.
Hi, my name is Gina. I'm an alum of NYU and also a member of the Incarceration to Education Coalition. I was joined by another member of our coalition during the keynote address before he was asked to leave for holding signs that I hope everyone in the room was able to see. We are a group of community and student organizers working to abolish the box on college applications that forces applicants to disclose criminal records. We see this box as discriminatory and an extension of mass incarceration, and I would hope that you would all agree, especially since it seems as if you all agree that education is one of the best answers to reducing recidivism. Now, NYU, along with most colleges in this country, uses this box, and we're concerned about the tensions between the policies of the institution that we're all sitting in right now and your stated efforts to reduce mass incarceration. So I'd therefore like to ask all of you what your views are on screenings for criminal records, not just with higher education, but also with employment and housing, and if you would all individually give our efforts to increase access to education a statement of support at this time.
So, Jeremy, as the expert on reentry, in terms of if
Well,
you
but-
want to talk kind of broadly about kind of reentry and education and banning the box and
Got it.
efforts on that.
So, the first direct answer to your question, John Jay does not ask that question, so I'm pleased to say. And that's also true for the City University of New York, which is committed to access to education, so I'm pleased to say that. But I think we're, as your question indicated, outside the norm, so I think there's a growing movement. The New York Times is now behind your cause, and Center for Cordell CCA, whatever the Community Alternatives, right, put out that great report. So I think there's, within the field of higher education, as there has been generally in the ban the box movement as it applies to city governments, there's been a rising awareness of the need to sort of rethink that. So I think that is changing. But you raised a larger question in your setup, which is that how do we think about college education and education generally vis-a-vis our prisons? So I think one of the great tragedies of the country is that in the same 1994 Crime Act that a number of us have been looking back on and trying to assess how what it's meant for the country, we also stopped the Pell funding for college education. So that immediately dropped from here to here the number of people who were incarcerated who were also studying for college. So at the same time, they were putting more people in prison, and during the time of their lives when they could be doing something with their minds and getting college credit, we're also denying them through that funding decision the ability to go to college unless it's privately funded. So some institutions like Bard and Cornell and John Jay, we have our faculty in prison teaching, and very proud to do that, but it's not enough. So my hope is that the next phase of this movement actually is to really operate at the federal level to restore Pell funding for college education. I think that would be a great step forward. But the related point is how do we connect the time of reentry, since everybody comes out of prison at some point? If they're college students while they're in prison, how do we connect them to a continuation of their college when they come out? And since that average prison term is about 3 years now, so it means there's a lot of churning in and out. So the public universities, and this is where I'm very proud of my university, really have an opportunity to think about reaching in at the same time that they're providing an appropriate platform for people when they come out. So, Ann Jacobs is here somewhere. She runs the prison to college pipeline. We're explicitly working on that connection so when people come out of prison with college credits, they can continue their college education, and college becomes part of their reentry plan. That's the way these are our brothers and sisters who are coming home, and they should be in college if they're ready for college.
Thanks. Where is the next question? Go ahead.
My name is Al Simmons, and I'm one of the people that he's talking about. I graduated from Bard College in May after doing 8 years in prison. I thank this panel for coming down and speaking with us, but at the same time, I would have to also say that I'm sadly disappointed with reentry on the ground. I've been home for 6 months, I'm still homeless, I'm still unemployed. But one of the things that Mr. Travis was speaking about that I think is a major problem is the problem of public opinion. When he was talking about the SNAP program, one of the things that we know about the SNAP program, along with the incentives that was given to the states, is that they had an enormous advertising campaign for people to apply for SNAP. Just like we talk about history in World War II, when the men went off to war to get women jobs, they had an enormous advertising campaign. So my question is, when we talk about spending dollars and funding, do we ever think about using some of that money to inform the public that maybe they should give people like me, who has a college degree, but served time in prison, an opportunity to be able to succeed? And I think without that, you can spend all the money in the world. If I go to IBM and they look at my application and throw it in the garbage because I checked the box, then it doesn't mean anything.
So I'm going to ask Mark to weigh in just sort of generally on public opinion and how we can sway public opinion to sort of come to adopt some of these policies to reduce mass incarceration.
But thank you for being here, sir, and congratulations on being out. I know it's a tough road. I was going to try to frame a little bit about what we've been talking about all day since we're the last panel, and bring it back to this issue of public policy and public funding, and also sort of this gentleman's example. I think there's 4 questions that as a society we have to ask about criminal justice. One is, what are we going to criminalize as a nation? What are we going to decide is a crime and it isn't a crime? The second is, for those things we decide that are crimes, how are we going to punish them? The third is, for those we decide to punish by sending to jail, what do we do with them while they're in prison? And fourth, what do we do to them when they get out? So the problem right now can be, I mean, as much consensus as there seems to be across the nation, and I've been involved in these issues for 25 years, the sort of thing I fight against in terms of my own personal pessimism is all of those questions are really big time in the wrong direction. We've criminalized almost everything. I guarantee you we've all broken the law 6 or 7 times today already. Secondly, how are we going to decide how we punish what we criminalize? Well, we don't punish everything by incarceration. But I will tell you, as a criminal defense attorney, almost everything we don't give jail time for, we give suspended jail time for. And guess what? It comes back to hit you in the back of the head before too long. So incarceration ends up happening in many cases when we don't really want to incarcerate people. Secondly, what are we doing for people when they're in prison? Not much. When I was president of Prison Fellowship, I had the opportunity to visit literally hundreds of prisons across the U.S. and the world, and it's really, really sad. Not much. There's some great programs, but they're isolated and random. It's not systemic. And finally, what are we doing to people when they get out? It's a crushing burden. It would be one thing if you got out and you just had to compete with everybody else who didn't go to prison, right? But if you get out and you don't have a driver's license and you can't get a job in anything that requires licensure, and of course the states have licensed almost everything now, it is a crushing, crushing burden. You're facing that, I'm sure. People who have to face applications to check a box. I get calls out all the time. How should I answer this question? There's a gentleman here today, Jesse Weiss. Jesse, I don't want to embarrass you, but stand up back there. So Jesse, I met about 10 years ago. He was a prisoner in Iowa. As a college student, he'd gotten involved in drugs and decided one day he was going to rob a bank, take a hostage, and use a gun. So when I met Jesse, he was in prison in Iowa for quite a long time. He had the benefit of being in a pretty successful reentry program. He got out. He actually worked with prisoners in reentry in Iowa and across the country for a while after he got out. He then got accepted to law school and graduated top 10 in his class, was the chairman of the honor court. He clerked for a juvenile judge in Virginia. He was allowed to sit for the Virginia bar and pass the first time. But then he had to go before the bar, Virginia State Bar. The committee who hears initially whether people with a felony record should be entitled to practice law in Virginia unanimously agreed that Jesse should be able to be a practicing lawyer in Virginia. The bar council, the sages, said no and told him you have to wait 2 years to reapply. So Jesse is fortunate enough to have gotten a job. But there's no reason Jesse shouldn't be able to practice law. Jesse's involved in this issue we're involved in now across the nation. But the point is, just the collateral consequences alone for people who come out of prison feed the mass incarceration on the backside. As Jeremy pointed out a minute ago, we got into this problem by increasing mandatory minimums. And the whole reason I'm involved in this today, just a bit of a personal story, is I helped create this problem. I went into the Senate of Virginia in the mid-'80s. I was big on tough on crime, so we abolished parole in Virginia. We lowered the age at which juveniles could be tried as adults from 16 to 14. We instituted truth in sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out. By the time I became Attorney General of Virginia, I was tired. I couldn't think of anything else to do. There was nothing left on the table, and there's very little left on the table today in the United States to get tough on crime. And then after that, I went to work for Prison Fellowship and started visiting prisons, and I realized what a bad thing I had done. And so in thinking about it, you know, I think the thing that drove me was I didn't view criminals as human beings, I viewed them as criminals. I didn't view people who came before the justice system having been accused of committing a crime as people like me. They were somebody else, because I didn't grow up knowing anybody like that. But then when I started visiting prisons across the country, I met all these people like Jesse and other people, and they could have been my sons, my brothers, they could have been me, except for one degree of separation. And so I sort of find myself in the sort of odd situation of spending the second half of my life trying to undo what I did the first half. It's very frustrating. But to bring it back to the focus of this panel, on those 4 questions, what do we criminalize? How do we punish people who've committed the crimes we have decided are crimes? Third, what do we do to people when they're in prison? What do we do with them when they get out? If we could have funding at the state and federal level tied to objectives that are going in the opposite direction of where we've been going for the last 20 years, it could make a real sea change. And there's plenty of political will to do it, but you know, this is sort of the last thing on most policymakers' agenda. So we almost have to serve it up for them and do it for them so they can go out there and talk about the stuff that they think everybody else wants to talk about. And one way to do it for them is to do this sort of performance-based funding. It can be a huge help. It's under the radar, not in a sense that we're trying to hide it from anybody, but it's just something you do in the routine course of governing. You decide how you're going to make people accountable for federal and state dollars. And if you can do it in a way that pretty much everybody agrees it ought to be done, bingo, we've got a great solution.
Thank you. So on that note, we are actually out of time. So I just wanted to thank our speakers as well as our audience.
We have a few housekeeping things to mention, and then
Having been educated by one.
Before you head out, we just have a few closing remarks and a few housekeeping items. Thank you again to this wonderful panel and to Enamai for leading it. For those of you, again, who need CLE credit, we need you to turn in all of your CLE materials at the table right outside this door. Also, remember to sign out at that CLE table to receive credit. Also, in your folders, in front of you, there is, thank you, in front of you, there is a form that you can fill out in order to receive Brennan Center updates. My colleagues put together wonderful newsletters and all kinds of updates to keep you posted about writings that we're publishing and events that we're holding. If you are interested in getting that information, please fill that out. And also, the wonderful name tag that you've been given. I know you're all anxious to go out and change the world. We just need a few more minutes. The name tag that you've been given, if you could please turn that back into my colleagues who are staffing the conference, they'd greatly appreciate that. And with that, I will turn it back over to our president, Michael Waldman, for closing remarks.
Well, I will be brief. First of all, I want to thank this remarkable panel, which has so much budget expertise matched only by its passion and its political savvy, and we are really grateful.
for the conversation. I want to thank everybody who's spoken here today, everybody who's been part of the audience with questions and conversation, and again, to thank my colleagues at the Brennan Center, Inamai Chetiar and her colleagues in our justice program, Jafreen Uden and Desiree Ramos and Janine Plant-Chirlin and their colleagues in our communications department, and the financial supporters of the Brennan Center who made this possible. We are grateful to all of you for the incredible hard work, for the commitment, for the passion, and we at least feel energized, inspired, and determined to move forward with all of you in this critical fight for our country and our values, and we look forward to keeping it going. Thank you so much.
I didn't get your question.